Good morning, everybody. Buenos días a todos. We have here today three very special writers. One Irish, John Banville, one Spanish, at least he's from Barcelona, Enrique Vila-Matas, and Eileen Battersby. I'm not sure if Eileen wants to be described as a very important literary journalist, or what always impresses me about Eileen is the quantity of books that she manages to read apart from her writing. You know, she's just finished the Booker Prize winner, the winner's novel, which is some 800 pages, I think, wasn't it? Anyway, we'll come to you in a moment. What I'm proposing to do is do this in stages, really, to talk to John a little bit first, and then to talk to Enrique, and then we'll leave Eileen to the last to pick up the pieces, okay?
Steady hands.
John, I wanted to start by, you work under two writerly names, John Banville, and of course your other persona, Benjamin Black. And I was thinking of an essay by Jorge Luis Borges, a short story really, where it's called Borges y yo, Borges and myself. And Borges makes the point that really he doesn't recognize the Borges when the letters come in the post and the emails are sent to him. Perhaps not emails in the case of Borges, but there's another Borges out there. And I just wonder, do you have a sense of a stable selfhood?
Oh, no, well, I don't think any of us has a sense of stable selfhood. This myth of the singular self is sort of spelt religion. The notion of a soul, which I don't believe in. I think it's much more interesting than that. We are a collection of poses and attitudes. We're a collection of selves. That makes life infinitely interesting, because one is a different person at every moment, which fascinates me. As a writer, the person who sits at the desk and writes ceases to exist when I get up from the desk and walk away. We are two entirely separate beings. The citizen who walks about the world has very little connection with the artist, let's call him, who sits at his desk and writes.
Could you tease out a little bit how you see Benjamin Black as a novelist?
Well, Benjamin Black is a craftsman. I've made a living, such as it was for most of my life, in journalism. I didn't write journalism. I was a technician. I was the person who changes other people's words. Remember, Eileen?
Putting it into English.
And so I wrote during the day at home. Then at night I went into the office. I was two entirely different people then. So creating another person, another persona to write crime fiction was not difficult. And it's fun. Black enjoys himself. Poor Banville has a terrible time on it.
Well, we're going to come to the question of the city in the moment, but obviously two authors whose names always appear on occasions like this are James Joyce and Samuel Beckett. Would you like to comment a little bit on how important those two writers have been for you in your literary career?
Well, I'm not sure what importance means in this context. I admire them. I suppose every Irish writer, there are two roads you can take. There's the Joycean or the Beckettian. I suppose I took the Beckettian. And there he is, it's Beckett. Sam speaking from above. I followed the Beckettian route, I suppose, inwards rather than outwards.
Yeah, but Harold Bloom, the American critic, once wrote this book called The Anxiety of Influence. So I suppose that's what I'm getting at, the extent to which all contemporary writers are anxious about the writers that they carry within them.
Well, Bloom sets up a rather contentious notion that, every writer has to kill the father or the mother, as the case may be. I don't find that. I don't find that the influence of Beckett or Yeats, which is pretty minimal on my work. I mean, the influences on me, if there are any, are Henry James and Yeats. Those are the two writers. Nobody ever notices this, so don't tell anybody. But influence is a curious thing. I mean, influence is something that has to be resisted, always. And the greater the writer, the easier it is to parrot that writer's style. It's very easy to write like Beckett. I mean, what you write is no good, but you can sound like Beckett. You know, keep saying no often enough. And keep saying yes, and you'll sound like Joyce.
The Quirk novels you set in 1950s Dublin, I was just wondering why that decade particularly?
Well, I was born on the 8th of December, which is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. They almost got it right. That was also the day that people from the country came to Dublin to do their Christmas shopping. And I would be brought from Wexford on the early morning train to Dublin. I would go to see my aunt in her flat in Upper Martin Street, which I inherited in time. She would have a cake, and then I would be taken to Cleary's department store, and my mother would buy me a watch, 10 and 6 penny watch, which would last for about 3 weeks, and then would fail. But it was pure magic for me coming to Dublin on that day. The smell of diesel fumes from buses still seems to be quite a romantic smell. So I liked that period. I liked trying to recreate it. I liked delving down into my memories in that time to see what I could come up with. And I came up with more than I thought I would. So it's great fun recreating this dark, wounded little world of Ireland in the 1950s.
Just a final question for the moment. Another city that has intrigued you, I understand and I know, is Prague. Again, why Prague? Is it just a city that you happened on? Is it because of influences from literary influences like the presence of Kafka, who seems to preside over Prague in every respect?
I used to love Prague in the old days when they were, oppressed. They were much more interesting before tourism had destroyed the city. I rarely go back now. When they built the McDonald's just at the Charles Bridge, I thought this is the end of the Prague that I knew. It's one of the 3 magic capitals of Europe. Lyon and Torino, Turin are the other 2. It is a magical place. It's very strange. You walk along a crowded avenue and you turn off into another avenue, which will be completely empty. And you walk along, and it's very, very seldom in the center of a major city that you hear your own footsteps, which you do in Prague. And it's an eerie place. And I went back to get a prize there a couple of years ago. I went back in winter, and I sort of fell in love with it again, because in winter there are very few tourists.
Enrique, I'm going to turn to you for a moment. Voy a hablar un poco en español, ¿no? Enrique, tú eres de Barcelona, entonces una gran ciudad, pero tienes una afición especial en cuanto a tu amor para Dublín. Entonces, sé que vas a leer un poquito te voy a hacer unas preguntas sobre dublinesca en un momento, pero si quieres hablar un poquito de por qué Dublín.
Bueno, yo pensaba que me ibas a preguntar por Dublín en la primera pregunta y quiero ser un poco preciso en la respuesta y voy a utilizar lo que escribió sobre mi libro Dublinesca un amigo, Eduardo Lago, que es mi Benjamin Black privado. Y él dice que en el capítulo 12 de Moby Dick hay un marinero tatuado del que Herman Melville dice que nació en una isla que no aparece en ningún mapa, como ocurre siempre con los lugares de verdad. Dice la frase, dice mi Benjamin Black, la frase es perfecta para caracterizar la ciudad donde transcurre la acción de Dublinesca. Porque el título de este libro, tomado del poema de Philip Larkin, describe el paso del cortejo fúnebre de una prostituta, nos sitúa en las calles de estuco de un Dublín evanescente. En manos de Vila-Matas, la ciudad se convierte en un lugar sin límites. No los hay entre la vida y la muerte, entre el día y la noche, entre la realidad y la ficción, entre la página impresa y la pantalla digital. Él habla, pues, de un que asomaba permanentemente la pantalla de su ordenador, el personaje central, a merced de la infinitud oceánica de Internet, el narrador aguarda la llegada de la muerte, aferrado a un tesoro de valor incalculable y que no ocupa lugar, las lecturas acumuladas a lo largo de toda una vida. El espacio en el que se encapsula la ciudad creada es doble, es virtual a la vez que real. En realidad, y esto ya lo digo yo, la novela habla de Nueva York, no de Dublín. Lo que sucede es que el personaje central desearía vivir en Nueva York y acaba, como en todas las novelas, más bajo de lo que pretendía. En realidad, cuando digo más bajo, me baso en lo que contara Brendan Behan, no sé cómo se pronuncia en inglés, Brendan Behan, que cuando conoció Nueva York, luego cuando veía Inglaterra le parecía un lugar muy plano, por ejemplo, ¿no? Por lo tanto, el drama, el conflicto en dublinesca, entre otros, para tener conflictos novelescos que puedan decir que tengo trama, aunque para mí es más importante el estilo, la trama de dublinesca se centra, entre otras cosas, en la desgracia. Normalmente todas las novelas tienen conflictos. Aquí tenemos a una persona que desea vivir en Nueva York y acaba en Dublín. Y que desearía ser como Joyce y acaba siendo como Beckett. Porque, en definitiva, la novela también trata de contar el recorrido que se hace a través de un puente que enlazaría la novela contemporánea a James Joyce, que es la grandeza, con la miseria, que sería Beckett. Desde luego yo soy un escritor más cerca de Beckett que de Joyce. Me atrevo más con Beckett que con Joyce. Desde luego me atrevo más con Beckett porque efectivamente es más sencillo de resumir diciendo nunca, nada, jamás, etc., ¿no? Y se conozco el estilo. En dublinesca, la segunda parte, la parte final del libro, es beckettiana, y ahí estoy libre de ataduras joycianas, porque el personaje tiene una resaca formidable, y al tener resaca puede estar loco, y la voz de la locura cuadra más con mi literatura que todo lo que he tenido que escribir antes de la parte de joyciana. Pero sin haber pasado por Joyce no habría podido llegar a ese momento de libertad que tengo al final del libro, donde el personaje pues, está encerrado en una habitación, en una de estas sillas beckettianas, a merced de lo que piense y de su propia locura. Estoy pensando que Cervantes, en libros como El licenciado Vidriera, utilizaba una excusa para poder presentar a personajes que estaban locos para la época. Y la locura siempre está ligada con la libertad, sin lugar a dudas para mí.
Muy bien. Bueno, me encantó la novela. Trata de un editor en crisis y estoy pensando, te quiero preguntar si tú piensas que la crisis más bien es la crisis de la muerte del libro también, pues porque él es editor. Y ¿tú piensas que los nuevos medios de comunicación, el Internet, todas estas cosas, influyen de manera negativa en cuanto a la lectura y todo eso, ¿no?
Bueno, la novela trataba en realidad de un escritor que estaba acabado. Y cuando llevaba 100 folios, ya había creado una serie de situaciones. Y me di cuenta de que si lo sustituía por algo muy ajeno a mí, un editor, podía mantener todo lo escrito, pero cambiaba todo, todas las escenas y las situaciones. El editor siempre piensa diferente. Y mucho, además, más de lo que parece. Y por lo tanto, me empecé a divertir cuando lo convertí en un editor. A partir de aquí, el editor estaba acabado porque el escritor estaba acabado. En este caso, era un editor que creía que era el fin del mundo porque su editorial cerraba. Pero actualmente, el fin del mundo ha existido siempre. Todas las generaciones han creído, por angustia existencial, que detrás de ellos ya todo era muy raro, se enrarecía, todo venía a ser extraño. Hoy en día oímos repetir que el mundo ha cambiado mucho en 50 años, que ha cambiado a una velocidad, pero yo creo que el mundo viene cambiando a una velocidad extraordinaria, que la esencia del arte es pasar, es decir, va a tanta velocidad que son como las nubes, que de alguna forma no hay tiempo para colocarlas en museos o en una enciclopedia. Y no es ninguna tristeza ni ninguna desgracia. Creo que el arte pasa como la vida, y ese es el arte que a mí me interesa. El arte de alguien que puede decir que lo ha visto, pero que ya no está en ningún museo ni está localizable, sino que está allá fuera que solamente es lo que ha vivido él. Pero cuando se refiere a lo que ha visto, ya no está, porque es un tipo de arte conceptual que he visto este verano pasado en la documenta de Kassel, por ejemplo, que es un arte que es precisamente la experiencia propia de haberlo visto, pero del que no queda ya luego rastro. En este sentido, se acerca mucho a mi concepción esta mañana, porque esta tarde puede que piense otra cosa de lo que es el arte.
Muy bien. Volviendo a la figura de James Joyce, ustedes han creado una cosa que se llama la Orden de Finnegans. Y yo no sé si a la gente le interesa esta idea, porque me gustaría saber de dónde ha venido esta idea. Toma su nombre de un pub en Dalkey, y según yo tengo entendido, los caballeros de la orden se obligan a celebrar la novela Ulises cada año y asistir cada año al Bloomsday. ¿Me puedes decir algo de este fenómeno?
Esto, yo no sé cuál es la traducción al inglés de la palabra gamberrada.
Sí, gamberrada. Como
nació como una historia de pandilla, de grupo veraniego perdido, y que casualmente nos encontramos en Dublín, cada uno por un motivo distinto, todos escritores españoles, y decidimos infiltrarnos en el Bloomsday. Yo sé que para John Banville, por ejemplo, Bloomsday significa algo a lo que no asiste nunca, posiblemente que le es indiferente. Del mismo modo que a mí, yo jamás he visitado la Sagrada Familia de Barcelona, ni me gusta Gaudí, porque lo he visto toda mi vida. Y me da igual, es decir, no conozco. Yo siempre he dicho que me gusta París porque no tiene edificios de Gaudí. Nosotros venimos al Bloomsday sin ningún respeto hacia la figura del Bloomsday ni de Joyce, al contrario. Por las mañanas vamos al pub Los Enterradores, el pub de Gradivers, en las verjas del cementerio de Glasnevin. Allí bebemos unas pintas de cerveza, nos peleamos, vamos a comer, leemos un fragmento del Ulises en español. Tiene gran éxito la lectura porque el primer año dijimos que éramos anarquistas españoles, y parece que la palabra anarquistas gustó mucho porque nos aplaudieron por ser anarquistas, no por otra cosa. Y ahí leemos el final del 6º capítulo de Ulises. Y lo hacemos cada año. Luego por la tarde, a las 6 menos 10, antes de que cierren Torre Martelo, subimos arriba, cuando ya se ha ido todo el mundo, y con la ayuda de las señoras que había hasta ahora abajo, cerramos la torre y nombramos un caballero nuevo cada año. Pero naturalmente, ya cuando nombramos al caballero, estamos casi todos, menos yo, todos borrachos, menos yo. Y normalmente el caballero recibe con la espada un golpe importante en la cabeza. Luego, cuando termina esto, por la carretera, caminando, vamos al pub de Dalkey, que se llama Finnegans, pero que no tiene nada que ver con Finnegans Bake. Se llama Finnegans por la familia Finnegans del pub. Y allí intentamos redactar la constitución de la orden. Terminan grandes peleas, no nos ponemos jamás de acuerdo hasta el año siguiente.
Sí, yo tuve el gran placer de estar con vosotros hace un par de años. Fue muy interesante en Finnegans, ¿no? Eileen, can I turn to you? You can take off your...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Though
This is amazing.
You're from the United States area, but I think a lot of us just think of you as probably Irish now, because you're almost Irish, aren't you? You've been here so long, no?
Fossilized over 5,000 years, yes. Firstly, I have just been listening to this simultaneous translation. I have to share my experience here. I needed to hear your voice. I didn't know what you were saying, but my other ear was telling me what you were saying, but I wanted to hear you. Firstly, I'm here in the privileged position of having John Banville there and Enrique Vila-Matas here, and of course you. But both of these writers, in my view, are very much influenced by Nabokov. Not so much influence, maybe that's wrong. They share a sensibility with Nabokov. I have read all of John Banville's work, and I've read the books by his friend Benjamin as well, you see, these two people. And I have read the 3 books in English translation so far of your books. I reviewed Dublinesque, and I've read the Montano and Bartley, and I'm obsessed with Melville. So, you know, I mean, but I'm sure that you all here can probably read Enrique Vila-Matas in Spanish as well. Can you all? Yeah? Well, then I mean, these books are wonderful. They're very, very funny, incredibly literary. And I just assumed that you spoke English because you had everybody, John Cheever in your books, Melville, Thomas Pynchon, incredible. Sebald, unbelievable. You must read everything. I think the 3 books are wonderful. I thought Dublinesque was so funny. Such a fun book. I love the idea of the anarchists, yeah. But the great scene in the hotel, when they go down to eat breakfast in the dark in the hotel, it's so funny. I love that book. But Bartleby and Co. as well, this idea of writers deciding enough is enough, or too much, or too little is enough, or too much. And then in Montano, I think the idea of being literature sick, because you have a character who can't function without literary references and cross-references. And you were looking at a person who has just driven 120 miles an hour, having spent the last 2 days, it wasn't the Booker book, I read that a long time ago, it was Donna Tartt's book, the 771 pages of The Goldfinch. I have read that in just less than 2 days and wrote the review. But I have to say that she has lots of literary cross-references too, but it's operating around 5 speeds lower than your work, because you have so many cross-references. And I love the idea of what you said about these impressions of art going fast like clouds. I mean, it does. All these impressions. The Donna Tartt book, she takes the Goldfinch painting by Fabricius, which is, as we know, in Holland, this wonderful painting, and it's quite a sad story that the young artist was there in the explosion in 1654, and he was killed, and most of his work was destroyed. But the Goldfinch, the painting, lived on. The Goldfinch was here a few years ago in a touring exhibition. But just, you know, I'm totally kind of offered a mangle kind of thing, that kind of preempting what you said. But yeah, I still have a US passport. I cry when I hear the American national anthem. I can listen to the Irish national anthem without it affecting me. I'm sorry. I'm very interested in Ireland, but I mean, as an outsider, I'm really interested in Ireland. But you get to the stage that you don't really belong anywhere. I get embarrassed by some of the stuff that happens under the name of the United States, and other things fill me with pride. There's lots of great things about America. There's lots of terrible things. But I had to laugh when I saw myself as the representing the United States. I kind of thought I was representing the Irish Times. I didn't think I was representing the United States. But I certainly couldn't represent Ireland either, although I did run for the Irish universities. And, you know, but I mean, you know, but I just think, like, I feel very privileged that I can just, I'm paid to read. So I just read all the time. My eyes, as you can see, are very small and tired, although they're constantly being filled with steroids. But I mean, I just read all the time. And I love John's work. I think John is incredibly funny and very learned. John Banville, John Banville's work is incredibly funny, very stylish, very elegant, very much. And I think I could see the Henry James, but I can certainly see Nabokov. But I mean, John is John, and John has his own voice. And with the Quirk books, I mean, you've got a tremendous sense of Dublin, Dublin that I obviously don't know, and very atmospheric. And John is single-handedly, as far as for me, making me read thrillers that I never thought I'd read. And I suppose, too, you have a respect for Magri, Simeon, George Simeon, am I right?
Magri books I don't read.
But the Simeon.
Simeon is a great...
Yeah, I meant the non-Magri part of Simeon, actually. And I mean, I'm pleased to be sitting here so I could say how much I enjoy reading the 3 of your books that I have been able to read. The problem is this, for me, and you touched on it with The Familiar, is that I grew up in California, so the Spanish language culture was very much part of our world. So, being a perverse child, I was very interested in German language and Russia. So it was always Central and Eastern European work for me, and I suppose because of the classical music as well. And I, you know, stumble through the German that I try to read, and I can read French. And I should know this sounds terrible. You know, I'm sitting in this institute. I should be able to at least read Spanish because it was part of my childhood and my young life growing up. We went down to Mexico a lot. We were very involved with horses. So we knew a lot of very good Spanish horse people and everything. So, I mean, I'm here in a flood of embarrassment that I can't understand. I can't understand without the translator. But I can hear your voice, and the voice is familiar. So, you know, not good enough, but but you can understand me more than you're letting on.
Nos entendemos mejor así. Nos entendemos, podemos llegar a ser grandes amigos gracias a hablar idiomas distintos. Podemos llegar a ser grandes amigos hablando idiomas distintos, precisamente. La investigación que inicié sobre Dublín tenía una dificultad añadida, como en las aventuras, que siempre el héroe tiene más problemas de lo normal, añadidos. Y la dificultad era que al no hablar inglés, cuando quería preguntar, y he preguntado mucho, necesitaba siempre de alguien. Por lo tanto, he tenido que abrirme mucho al mundo para encontrar personas que me facilitaran la labor, y siempre he dependido de otros para poder iniciar la investigación. Digamos que no sé inglés, pero es una dificultad añadida. Ha sido para... Y que cuando fui la última vez a Nueva York, en la aduana, la policía, una señora negra, se extrañó mucho de que no supiera contestar a sus preguntas, a su interrogatorio. Dejé las huellas, me hizo la fotografía y finalmente se cansó de que yo no hablara inglés y me dijo, pase, enfadada. Pero cuando ya había pasado y yo me sentía liberado, me hizo volver y entonces me hizo la pregunta terrible. Me dijo, ¿y cómo es que no sabe inglés? La pregunta era que no podía comprender, es decir, cómo era que no sabía inglés. Y ahí se resume todo también, de alguna forma. Era sospechoso de algo.
Well, that's the great hegemony of English, isn't it? The tyranny of English. Yeah.
But can I just interrupt something? Jimpar Lahari, who was on the Booker shortlist, I interviewed her some weeks ago in Dublin. I had met her before. And when she won the Frank O'Connor Prize that I was the judge for. But she's been living in Rome for the past year. And suddenly this woman who was kind of tormented and wary when I met her before, not because I was speaking to her, she just was naturally, because she was caught between all these cultures. But now she's living in Rome, she's speaking Italian, she's reading Italian, she's reading Tabucchio, Antonio Tabucchi, she's reading him. And she said that the paper, the La Repubblica, the paper, 3 pages of books a day, all international fiction, writers, interviews with Martin Amis, pieces about American writers, Central European, German. And I kind of said, aha. And I actually said to her, now I figure out this guy, Enrique Vila-Matas, because you have such a range of reading in your books. And like a lot of the French writers, it's not clever, kind of snooty clever, as Welbeck, or neurotic clever like Welbeck does so well. It's a real kind of enthusiastic kind of thing that an American could really understand. So I think that's very interesting. I think the thing that drives a lot of the Spanish language fiction, and again I'm speaking here as a complete imposter because I'm reading it thanks to these geniuses, these heroes, the unsung kind of warriors, the literary translators who we should worship at their feet. I mean, they're such important people. I mean, they're so gifted. They've done so much. They've opened so many doors for readers. Only today in the Irish Times, I have a novel review that was written in Spanish, a first novel by the Cuban ballet dancer Carlos Acosta. This is his debut novel. It's actually very good. Translated by Frank Wynne, who comes from Sligo. And I didn't know that. I thought he was American. This very good literary translator, translating from Spanish and French, is actually from Sligo. But I mean, thanks to these guys, what they do. But just as I say, going back to this enthusiasm, it's actually almost in the speed of the way you speak Spanish, or the way, it's a very fast language. And I think it's got energy and rhythms, and there's a music in it. And I'm very interested in Lorca. And I always thought that his plays, like he was murdered when he was 38, I always thought he would have written wonderful novels because he has a novelist's eye, the poet with a novelist's approach, I think. You know, but all this speed and energy and this overview, and I know Barcelona is this great literary capital in Europe, and all these writers from the Spanish-speaking cultures end up in Barcelona, either to stay or to at least be there. They know the place. And this whole thing, that's why, you know, it's looking out all the time. I do think the Irish readers look to the translated fiction, I can see that. But Irish readers do read international fiction, more so, I think, than the British. I think a lot of the British are very tied up in contemporary British fiction, and they don't look beyond British fiction. And that may sound like a kind of a sweeping generalisation, but I really see this. I mean, it has to be so, because the British publishers who are publishing fiction in translation, like, they practically kind of helicopter books into me because they think I'm the only person who's going to read them, because they say that the British reviewers don't. And I think that's such a shame. Unless you come up with like an industry like Bolano, and there's all these books. I mean, how many last books has he had published? 12? Every book is the last book, but it keeps on coming, you know? But again, it catches all that energy and colour. And you can hear it when you're speaking, and obviously I can see it even in these translated books of yours. So,
yeah.
Yo leía a Nabokov en traducciones pésimas. Traducciones pésimas de Nabokov. Ahí lo leí y imaginaba la grandeza de Nabokov gracias a que la traducción era pésima. Me permitía pensar que era mejor incluso de lo que es. Es decir, que... Y hay, por ejemplo, en España se traduce mucho literatura centroeuropea, que es económicamente muy asequible por las editoriales independientes. Y la literatura centroeuropea es un pozo de autores desconocidos por nosotros mismos también en España, extraordinaria. Es decir, que efectivamente que la lectura de otras literaturas evidentemente no sobra, ni mucho menos. Pero bueno, también se dice que en inglés hay tan buenos escritores que ya es autosuficiente también la literatura anglosajona. Yo en concreto no me quejo de nada, es decir, las cosas son como son y si son difíciles me parecen más divertidas.
Could I probe a little bit more what Eileen's just been saying about journalism? Because although John said in the Irish Times, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you gave the impression that you weren't writing journalism, but of course you do very important literary journalism for New York Review of Books and so on. So how does journalism, literary journalism, fit into your work? I mean...
Well, I'm a book reviewer. I'm not a critic. People ask me to republish my criticism, and I say, do you mean I should publish a book of book reviews? Which seems to me an absurd thing to do. I was very tempted recently because New York Review Books wanted to bring out a volume of 20 pieces, and I just said no, but book reviews are for the day. Book reviewing is an honourable pursuit. If you do it honourably, it is an honourable pursuit. It's necessary. It fulfills an important function. It introduces new books to potential readers. That's all I see my task as being. A critic places her work within the canon, but a reviewer says, this is a book you can't have read because it's not published yet. Here's my opinion of it. And that, as I say, it's an honourable and necessary trade. She's a phenomenon because she just, she reviews every week. I mean, her brain must be completely softened by now reading all that third and fourth rate fiction that she's been reading over the last 40 years or so. But again,
40 years. Now, come on.
Sorry, darling. Sorry, I was thinking myself. I have nothing but admiration for you. As I say, it's necessary. It keeps books in front of the reading public, and it emphasizes, or tries to emphasize, the importance of fiction. So it's a necessary thing.
Quiero hacerle una pregunta a Enrique. Enrique, tú también te metes mucho en la obra periodística, digamos, ¿no? Escribes para El País, etcétera, etcétera. ¿Cómo ves esta tarea en comparación con la tarea de escribir novelas?
Estrechamente ligada. No hay casi distinción entre lo que escribo como articulista y como novelista. Hago artículos en las páginas de cultura del país, pero esos artículos son tan literarios que lo lógico es que me hubieran despedido ya, pero me mantienen. Pero no son periodísticos. Son piezas que luego se pueden publicar en libro. Hablo de libros normalmente que me gustan, o algo que me ha gustado de un libro. Normalmente no sé hablar en forma destructiva porque no quiero perder el tiempo. Normalmente es algo, y me puede interesar cualquier detalle de un libro malo también, es decir, y hacer un artículo sobre eso. Pero en principio son artículos muy optimistas, aunque sé que se está derrumbando el mundo. Sí.
Y otra pregunta, volviendo un poco al tema de lo que estaba diciendo Eileen hace un momento, ¿tú ves el papel del escritor en Europa en general? ¿Se ve diferente, es diferente, es distinto? Que, por ejemplo, en el mundo anglosajón, los novelistas, los poetas, en general no se meten en la política, por ejemplo. Mientras que en el país, en el periódico, cada semana, tú ves artículos de Juan Goytisolo, de Mario Vargas Llosa, hablando de muchas cosas, cosas que están sucediendo en el mundo políticamente. Entonces, en nuestra sociedad, yo creo que eso no pasa, no sucede mucho.
Bueno,
¿Cómo ves
posiblemente porque el poder no hace el menor caso de lo que diga un escritor. Pero
en España, por ejemplo.
Hablo en general, claro. En primer lugar, en Irlanda o en Inglaterra. No creo que interese el poder cualquier cosa que diga un escritor. Y en España pasa lo mismo, pero los escritores en español insisten. Pero en realidad, en mi caso no, porque yo solamente dedico una línea de cada artículo al castillo de Kafka, ¿no? Ese corral de pollos descabezados. Pero bueno, ¿qué iba a decir? Bueno, me he perdido ahora con el corral. Pero...
Yeah. John...
No, había una historia, ¿no? Simplemente estaba pensando en el intelectual francés, perdón. Los intelectuales franceses, Tony Judt cuenta la anécdota del hombre que enviaron francés para espiar el tren Manchester-Liverpool, creo que era el primer tren que hubo en Inglaterra. Y este era un intelectual francés que estuvo viendo que el tren funcionaba de ida y vuelta durante días, tomó notas y cuando volvió a París hizo un informe por el cual dijo: he estado examinando el tren Manchester-Liverpool y no funciona. Entonces Tony Judt decía: esto es un intelectual francés.
Muy bien.
Bueno, un poco ese papel del intelectual europeo viene a ser decadencia también, ¿no?
John, if I could ask you a question about style. I mean, a lot of people say you're a consummate stylist. What is your style? Are you a stylist? Is that a compliment if people say that?
Before I answer that, I just want to follow what Enrique was saying and what you were saying about politics. My one involvement in public life was a few years ago. I discovered that they were carrying out vivisection experiments in Trinity College. So I wrote to the papers and I gave interviews and I created a little fuss. It lasted for a day or two. And the following year, the number of experiments, vivisection experiments in Trinity College doubled. Such is the power of the public intellectual. Style, as Henry James says, we move through, in style, we move through a blessed world in which we know nothing except through style. And I think that's true. To me, a badly written book is really not a book. It's something else. I spend my time trying to perfect sentences. At least once a day I say to myself, this is a crazy way for a so-called grown-up human being to spend his life. But that's what I do. It seems to me that this is the only thing I can do. Again, going back to public commitment. My only commitment is to try to make masterpieces. I have no moral, social, political interest, whatever. As a citizen I have, but as an artist I haven't. But the work of art, when it's made, is a moral object in the world. Its intentions weren't moral, but it is a moral object, if for no other reason than that it is the very, very best that a human being could do. There are very few things in the world that person has worked on for years and years to try to make it absolutely best. And not only be a piece of craft work, but to have a resonance beyond the craft. So that's why I'm a stylist.
I have a good story, actually. This is a good story. I'm very taken with this thing of translation. I don't think we're speaking enough about it, but considering we're going through it, But this great Russian writer, Vasily Grossman, things aren't going too good for him. He's working on a book called Love and Fate, right? Now, the authorities aren't happy, but they don't want to make a martyr of him like they did with Pasternak. They knew they made a mistake there, and he went on to get the Nobel Prize. So with Vasily Grossman in the late 1950s, what they do is, we're going to punish him, we're going to hurt him, but not not enough to kind of cause trouble. So what they do is they take his manuscript away, and that really hurts him more than being slammed in the gulag, right? So he has this, this thing has happened. They've taken his manuscript away, his marriage is falling apart, and he knows he has cancer. So everything is looking very grim. Then he gets the chance of a month in Armenia. They want him to go and to translate or to retranslate a book, an Armenian classic, that was translated so badly into Russian that it's virtually unreadable. Okay, so he's got a chance of a month in Armenia, and he's going to get paid for translating this stud book. So he takes himself off and arrives in Armenia with not a word of Armenian, right? And I think this is such a great story that the great Vasily Grossman, he writes an account of his trip in Armenia, called Sketches from Armenia. It is the funniest thing. And if you consider that at the heart of it, I mean, this is inspired travel writing, at the heart of it is a dud translation, which is kind of ironic considering what we're saying about translation. But yeah, they can go, you said about reading about translation. Reading about translation, it's like hearing a wonderful piece of music being murdered by somebody who can't play. And we're still somebody who thinks they can play and they can't. That's the one that really is agonizing. But that's what bad translation is like. But then on the other end, you've got the good translation. And the thing that's made it so possible here now, and no matter, when it first was introduced, I kind of thought, oh God, bring on the dancing girls. And I was very critical of Impact, the literary prize, because it was presented with such vulgarity and the biggest prize in the world and the money and the this, that and everything else. But it did give license for us to start looking at these books that were coming through in translation. So that's a good thing, you know. And then you've got like reading clubs in Kilkenny, you know, telling you that they've just done Magda Szabó's novel, The Door, in Hungarian. So you've got people down in Kilkenny reading an Hungarian novel in translation and loving it. That's a good thing. So I feel where we haven't really spoken about the city. And I suppose the thing, like, I see the reviewing, obviously I'm terribly privileged. I go down to my yard and there's a big, huge mailbox there with 10 books every day coming from, I'm like this mad child ripping open the jiffy bags, you know, thinking, oh my God, where am I going to go? Which one do I do? I mean, sometimes I might read 3 books and then decide, well, the 4th one is the one I'm going to write the review on. So hence I'm like reading all the time, which may explain why I'm slightly manic when I see humans, because I'm usually on my own, which is the animals, yeah? So, and the jiffy bags, of course. The jiffy bags are I treat these things, these receptacles as incredibly, they're like tabernacles. That's a great word, isn't it? Yeah, the jiffy bag is like the tabernacle that holds the book, and then it's what's going to come out. But I think, you know, the sense of, this is just an idea that maybe, because we're supposed to be talking about the city. Okay, we never really spoke about the city. But I think there's 2 things, and people ask this, and oh yeah, in case I forget it, I had the book Cromus with me, and I meant to bring it here. I think it's in the car. A-L-F-A-U. You've read him. Is he really good? Philippi, yeah. I thought that book was great. Cromus, yeah? Yeah, great classic book. Why am I said? I've just said that, by the way. But I think that the distinction is this. I see the reviewing as an information service. Like, I'm very pleased that I have enough books to keep me reading for the rest of my life. Right? I'm really happy about that. I love reading books. But a reviewer, it's a first impression. And no book is going to sink or swim. You know, the reviewer doesn't close down the book the way the theatre critic might close down a show on Broadway. You know, we're running out of time here.
Oh, I don't know, Eileen.
I don't know about that, but I'm just kind of thinking, you know, there's hype. Hype is the thing that's killing fiction, not hostile reviewers. Hype.
I've done some damage in my time, I'm glad to say.
Yeah. Well,
but
no,
I must tell you a little, I'll tell you a little anecdote about translation. My previous book, The Infinities, which is, I suppose, my most difficult one, certainly from a translating point of view. And there's a sentence in it, and I remember when I'd written it, I thought, my God, what will the poor translators do with this? Because a god is speaking, and he's saying how the gods are being coerced to do things by human beings. And he says, fine gods we are that we must muster to a mortal must. And I was in, well, I won't say where I was in a foreign country, and I was speaking to a translator, and I said, you know, when I wrote that sentence, I thought about translators, and I felt so sorry for you. And she said, I didn't notice that. And I thought, oh, Christ, if she didn't even notice the sentence. So I fear that a lot of translators, when they come to something difficult, they just skip it, like we did when we were learning to read. You know, if you came across a big word, you just skipped it. So,
Enrique, un momento, por favor. Just one comment on translation. I happen to think that the translations from Spanish into English in fiction are not very good on the whole. There's one classic case of this, the most, I think the best novel written in Spanish in the 20th century, Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, has had two translators. And as John was saying, Lysander Kemp, one of the translators, did precisely what you were saying because it's a novel written with a lot of vernacular, and when he came to a difficult sentence, saltó, he jumped to the next sentence, and that's a real problem. And I agree with you about the importance of literary translation. It's so important, but it's I'm afraid the Spanish experience, I think, is not very good. The Spanish novels into English.
Bueno, pero hay de todo. Yo, si no me equivoco, estamos en Dublín, Oscar Wilde. Hay una obra de Oscar Wilde que es La importancia de ser honrado. ¿Cómo se llama en inglés?
Importance of being earnest.
Yes. En español se tradujo La importancia de llamarse Ernesto. Y el grandísimo éxito, ediciones y ediciones, que ha tenido ha sido gracias al error del título, que es genial, La importancia de llamarse Ernesto. Y gracias a esto, y Henry James también tiene la llave, Screve, ¿no? En español se llama Otra vuelta de tuerca, que es un título extraordinario, porque se lo inventó el propio traductor. Nadie sabe lo que es otra vuelta de tuerca. Tuerca es una palabra que no estaba. Y todo el mundo ha comprado el libro por el título.
Well, another turn of the screw for that is that very few people realize nowadays that earnest in those days was slang for homosexual. So, of course, Wilde was thrilled to have this plastered all over London, the importance of being gay. And I also, there's the other nice thing that occurred to me, that John Brayne's novel of working class life from the 1950s, called Room at the Top, was translated into Swedish as The Attic. Still, I must say, just before I must agree with Eileen. Translators are the great unsung heroes and heroines. They get vilely badly paid. They never get thanked. Frequently on reviews, their name doesn't even appear. So, you know, for all the funny stories that we tell about them, still, they are heroes and heroines.
It's funny, there's a book, academic book, published quite recently by Methuen, I think it is, on translation. And I was quite surprised that I had interviewed Gerard Bacher, the Dutch writer, this book, The Twin. And I'd love that book. And 3 years later, then it ends up winning the Impact Prize because it has a very slow cycle, the Impact. And his book was translated by a guy called David Colmer, who's an Australian. And he actually showed up for the interview. Although David Bacher, Gerard Bacher, speaks very good English. He didn't much like journalists. But he said he'd speak to me because I had given the book a really favourable review. So I was really honoured.
That's
I
right,
bet.
it's for you.
Yeah. But the guy, the Australian guy, was very, very interesting. And he had gone to Holland and fell in love with somebody and then suddenly became fluent in Dutch and Flemish and Walloon and all this kind of stuff. So he's translating all this Belgian stuff as well. But he translated things. So I thought this is so interesting. So I did the interview with the two guys. And then when the photographer came, I said, well, can we have two together in the picture? And we did. So we had the writer and the translator shoulder to shoulder in the picture. Needless to say, the Australian guy was around 1 million times better looking than the author. But that was just by the way. But he's very, very good. But the thing is, like, the academic who wrote the book about translation said it was so incredible to see a translator being treated as a human being as opposed to an insect. Well, she didn't exactly use those kind of words, but that's what she meant. And I kind of think, God, aren't we an awful arrogant bunch when we're so dependent on the translators? But there's a book, an Venezuelan book, Tisek, Barreto Tisek. It's called The Sickness. And, you know, it's such an elegant book. And that's about a doctor who discovers that his father is terminally ill, and he actually reads the x-rays. It is the most incredible book, very, very well translated. I think that is a faultless translation. And, you know, Sebald, the great W.G. Sebald, the German writer, he spoke very good English, but he wrote, obviously, in German. And his books, they'd be, Anthea Bell was his translator, and they would go back and forth. On the 7th draft, they would decide, they would agree the version that we get to read. So, I mean, you know, it's not as, there have been some howlers. I mean, John's thing with the attic, I mean, there's been some very, very funny things, really, really funny things. But I mean, hey, I just read Donna Tartt's book, and the American English is translated into English, and that really hurts an American ear. And I'm kind of thinking, hey, we're complaining about books being translated from very difficult languages. And I mean, here we've got an English editor who can't keep their hands off American English. When most people go and see American movies in English without subtitles in England, I'm quite certain that the British moviegoers don't have subtitles on the American movies. But we have refrigerator being translated into fridge. And no American's going to say fridge. And there's a whole lot of stuff like that. So, I mean, really, you know, an American novel isn't safe in England. So, I mean, there's a huge amount of faith goes into this stuff about you're dealing with somebody's work of art, right, and being translated into, I don't know what John reads like in Japanese, you know, but I mean, you've got stuff, you know, being translated into all these different languages. It's a massive responsibility. I mean, reviewing somebody else's book is a big deal. It's a huge privilege. But I mean, that's a privilege to review somebody's book. But to translate it is a responsibility. And the thing I was going to say before, because I'm adult, you have to excuse my...
I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, but you have to allow the fact that I've read all these books, my brain is gone anyhow. So that's why I'm rambling. But I will say two things. We didn't address them, but we should think about them. And it's this. There's a sense of place. And a sense of place is very important, as the great Seamus Heaney showed from his mentor, Patrick Kavanagh. But there's also the sense of the city. And they're two different things, because the city in fiction very often is one of the major characters. And I think we should be aware of those distinctions. The sense of place, and then there's the city. And they are quite different.
And we haven't really addressed the question of the city. Before we finish, I really did want to open this up a bit to the public. I don't know whether we have a very strict 1:45 deadline or whether we can go on for another 5 minutes. We can, yeah? So I think we should take a couple of comments or questions from the floor. Anybody? Yeah, Rosa? We're okay. Anybody like to make a comment or ask a question of any of the writers here? I've given you the opportunity, so don't let me down.
Hardly delighted not to say Satan.
You want us to go now?
Yeah. Maybe I was a bit unfair in what I said about the translations from Spanish into English, but there's one classic case of a terrible translation of a brilliant novel in English into Spanish, and that's The Catcher in the Rye by Salinger, which has not been, the Spanish translation, the only one I know, and I think there only is one published translation, is absolutely appalling.
I hate that book.
So people, well, I love it, but anyway. I mean, you know, the fact that a novel like that has not received a translation into Spanish is just
How to Kill a Mockingbird? What kind of translation in Spanish?
I don't know what the Spanish is like.
Yeah?
¿Ocurre lo mismo con las traducciones del inglés al español? ¿O es diferente?
Francamente, yo no sé, porque normalmente cuando leo texto o novelas en español, las leo en español, no en traducción. Pero he visto unas traducciones malísimas, ¿no? De español a novelas por ejemplo, las novelas de García Márquez, yo creo que son mal traducidas al inglés. Yo no sé cómo son las traducciones al francés, por ejemplo. Ya he mencionado el caso de Juan Rulfo. Borges es otro caso trascendental, ¿no? Porque hay su traductor oficial, Norman Di Giovanni, ha hecho unas traducciones pésimas, ¿no? de Borges. Entonces, esta cuestión de traducciones es muy complicada y muy problemática, en mi opinión. Anybody? Yeah, at the back. Good.
The best Borges translator was the Irishman, Kerrigan, was it?
Yes.
But Borges got rid of him.
Yeah.
Borges got rid of him.
And apologies. In relation to translation, the most important thing is to give translators time and money.
Hear, 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 hear.
If you don't pay the translators and you don't give them access to the city, to the space, and where possible to the writers, the work is not going to be adequately rendered. We, in Ireland Literature Exchange, where I promote Irish literature abroad, where I host translators in Dublin. We make every effort to give the translators the time and the access to the writers. We had a translator recently who told us that she was translating Ulysses, and she was dreaming Ulysses. She was a Bulgarian who had never set foot in Ireland, but who had embraced Joyce and Ulysses. But at one stage, she took a carving knife and rammed it through her edition of Ulysses. She did recover, and she did complete the translation, and we took her to Dublin and took her to Sweeney's next door, where she got to read a section of Ulysses in a site which forms part of the novel. I'd just like to say that I'm really grateful to Eileen and to the other writers and you, Ciaran, for talking about translation with such knowledge and commitment and appreciation, because it is quite true, translation and the act of translators is...
But aren't you involved with the Stinging Fly, that very important
Yes.
translation? I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but
I'm Sinead McKay.
Yeah, because it was such an important issue, that the Stinging Fly, which is so important anyhow. This really good story, a mutual friend of ours, Cormac Kinsler, who won't mind me sharing this great story. He was at something or other, and Michael Hoffman was there, and the book of the moment was Alone in Berlin. I love Fallada. I've been reading Fallada for kind of like a million years. In fact, you had a copy of in the press. This is going back a million years. And I took it. It was What Now, Little Man, which came out in 1932 in Berlin and was translated within a year. Now, this is in the 30s, the height of the Weimar. I mean, just the rise of fascism, everything amazing. But anyhow, the old talk was Alone in Berlin, which had got its second life, as it were. And Cormac sees Michael Hoffman. He said, well, he said, have you read the book? Did you like it? And Michael Hoffman looked at him. He's the son, he's a poet, a translator. He's also the son of a very good German writer called Gert Hoffman. And he translated his father's work, even though the two guys never spoke. But Michael Hoffman said quietly, I translated it. And I thought, oh my God. That's what he said, yeah, you know, I mean, the translators, I mean, we owe them so much. And that's a good translation. I can tell you that that's a good translation. Michael Hoffman of Alone in Berlin. You know, so, I mean, yeah, we should really kind of revere these people. We should look after them. We should respect them. They should really get a huge amount of applause. We're so grateful to the translators.
And enough money and time to finish the projects, because one of the problems in Western Europe, strangely, is that the cheapest translator will be given the commission. And if you're given very little money, then you have to run on to the next project.
They almost spend more money on an index than they will on an index be made for a non-fiction book than to actually pay for the translation, which I think is outrageous.
Could I ask any final questions for John or for Enrique?
Well, I would just like to say before we finish that the theme, the city, which we haven't spoken about all, I found it fascinating to read Enrique's Dublinesque, and I kept asking myself what this feeling was, because it was sensual in a way. It was rediscovering one's city, and I realized that it was rather like discovering that the woman that you've been married to for 35 years is the object of desire of some other man. And you suddenly think, you look at her with new eyes and think, gosh, yes, she is a desirable creature. And you re-fall in love with her. So that was the experience of reading the book for me. And
I didn't think that at all.
Well, on your behalf, I'd like to thank the three writers, and thanks very much for coming, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the rest of the events today. Thank you.